government,
sanctuary,
policies, federal government, federal law, federal enforcement, federal government, sanctuary policies, enforcement, law, federal law enforcement, sanctuary, law enforcement by sanctuary policies, enforcement of law, sanctuary policies, government by federal, sanctuary, federal government, sanctuary policies, sanctuary policies, the sanctuary policy, enforcement, the federal government, the sanctuary policies, law enforcement policies, enforcement, the sanctuary, law enforcement, or sanctuary, federal sanctuary policies, federal law, federal policies, the federal government, and federal law, and federal sanctuary, federal government policies, the government, the sanctuary policies, sanctuary, the federal government,
sanctuary enforcement law. Policies, the federal law enforcement, federal law enforcement, federal law enforcement, enforcement, the federal government, the enforcement of federal law, the federal government, federal law enforcement, the federal government, law enforcement, law enforcement of federal law, the federal government, law, the federal law, federal law enforcement, federal government, federal law enforcement, the enforcement, the federal law enforcement, the federal government, the federal law enforcement, the sanctuary, law enforcement, federal law enforcement, enforcement, federal law,
sanctuary policies, the federal government, law enforcement, law, for sanctuary policies, the sanctuary law, sanctuary policies, the federal
sanctuary enforcement law, the government,
the law enforcement, the federal law enforcement, of federal sanctuary policies, of federal law,
sanctuary, the federal government law, sanctuary, the federal government,
sanctuary policies, the sanctuary government, law enforcement, federal policies, government law enforcement,
government.